Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello and welcome to Authors on Mission podcast, the podcast committed to exploring the strategies and insights of established experts who have achieved remarkable success in their fields and in the writing industry. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission, and I'm passionate about empowering authors with the knowledge and confidence needed to become experts. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Joseph Bolton, a truly unique voice in contemporary storytelling. His journey goes from Army veteran to contractor for the U.S. Air Force to author of original folktales, which just shows us the true power of connecting with one's roots, especially inspired by his book, Old Godmother's Tree, which is beautifully illustrated, as you can see in the background of Joseph's camera right now. So I'm excited to explore Joseph's unique approach to blending facts with folklore, his journey of ancestral discovery, and how his military background informed his creative process. Let's dive right in. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, same. And, to everybody listening right now, just take a look at his background. That gives us a little bit of an insight of, what you can expect from the artwork. Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. There's no better way to promote a book than by having it right up behind you, because it just draws that curiosity and it draws that eye. Something about the colors too, definitely. Yeah, so I would love to just get started with a little bit more about, what brought you to becoming a storyteller. I know you've been from many different walks of life. What exactly made you sit down and begin to write?
I think I've always been a person of imagination. Certainly as a child, I love stories. I love reading stories. I love creating my own stories with my own imagination. And I've always grown up with understanding about curiosity about my family's background. My mother's family came from Quebec. And I would always ask my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, what was the family like? Where did they come from? And I would get little bits and pieces of that story. So my grandfather would talk about visiting his cousins up in Quebec, the Mernier family, the old family farm. My grandmother would talk about her parents going to Saint Anne de Beaupré, a shrine up in Quebec, when they didn't have any children, to pray for children of their own. And I would always ask, what's the next, who are the grandparents? Who are your grandparents? What were they like? And it was always like trying to see a world through a translucent curtain. You could see shadows and shapes, but you never could really understand that. What was beyond, the whole background? I knew there was a greater story back there. And when I became, about 10 years ago, now that we have all these tools to research family history on Ancestry, and I gave my mother and her siblings a DNA test, to get a little bit of a background. And so I was able to actually develop a very robust tree about my family in Quebec. And I found very interesting ancestors. My family goes back to the very beginning of French settlement in Quebec. But I also found 4 gateway First Nations ancestors in Quebec also. We were not aware of, but I first found them through the DNA test. They said they were there, and it took me about 2 years to find them. And it was one ancestor in particular whose story I just found very inspiring.
Well, please tell us. Don't just stop there.
Yeah, sure. So anyway, her name was...
I
know. Well, good.
My next question was going to be, what was the most surprising discovery you made along the way? But I think you began to answer that, so please.
Yes, that was definitely the most surprising discovery we made, because we were always told, we're 100% French. But, there were definitely hints of a background, in our family. My grandfather, who all my native gateway ancestors go through my mother's father. And, he had kind of an olive looking skin, jet black hair. He didn't really look French. We think, well, he looks more like from Sicily, Italian. And then, some of my My mother's younger siblings would say, people would come up to them and say, are you half Asian? You had a look to them. They looked a little different. And so there was always this hint about that, but we always are told 100% French. So yes. So anyway, I was telling you about Mitio Goku and what made her special. So she was a young Algonquin woman living in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, which is kind of northeast of Montreal in the mid 1600s. She was married to an Algonquin named Assababish. And when she was 22 years old, she had two small children. And they were living happily in this village. And the Mohawks came up from New York, raided Trois-Rivières. Her husband was killed in the attack, and her two children were taken by the Mohawks, and she never saw them again or even knew what happened to them. So here she is at 22. She lost everything. But instead of giving in to despair, she rebuilt her life. 5 years later, after that happened, she married a French settler named Pierre Cauque, and together they became my ninth great grandparents. And we know a lot about her because of the record keeping of the Jesuit priests in Trois-Rivières at the time. But there was one thing that was written about her that really stuck with me. And when she died in 1699, the priest in Trois-Rivières wrote this about her. He said, Mitio Goku lived a full life with dignity, respect, and love, a courageous and loving Algonquin woman. And it's the most beautiful eulogy and the most powerful eulogy, only in 2 lines to say so much about her life, that she lived with dignity and respect. She was courageous. She was loving. And I think for a priest to write that about a woman, even a European woman, in 1699 would be rather unusual. But to write that about a First Nations woman, I think elevated it, that there was more to that story behind it. And so using the facts of her life and that very brief eulogy, I retold her story. Now, what makes this a little unique is that, many people have written stories about, historical fiction about their ancestors, especially if they're well-known ancestors. But what I did I retold it through the lens and through the language of folktales and folklore in that style of storytelling. So I took Mitio Goku, Pierre Cauque, their children, their families around them, and their story through time in Quebec, and I immersed it in a reimagined Quebec with magic, folktales, Native American-inspired trickster animal characters. And so I used that style to tell her story. And I use the folklore language because, and I call it language, not just a writing style, but I call it a language because folklore is something that talks about universal truths of human life and human existence and our lives as human beings. And that's universal throughout the world. So that's why I chose that language to tell her story. And the other thing we did is I teamed up with 2 great artists to help me do the book. One was a storyboard artist. Her name is Masami Kiyono, and she's out of Manhattan, and she has worked doing storyboard development for TV commercials, and she has done some for the Super Bowl 2 years ago. I think it was a Doritos commercial from a couple of years ago in the Super Bowl. And so she helped develop, kind of plan out all these illustrations. There were 450 in these first 2 volumes. And then to finish those illustrations, I worked with a very talented and wonderful artist named Natasha Pelly-Smith. She's from Toronto, and she is also of Cree and Ojibwe ancestry. So the Native American and the First Nation elements of the story really spoke to her as well. And as you can see from this one little illustration you can see in my background, she was very, very talented. And these illustrations, what made this also interesting is that these illustrations tell part of the story. They work very closely with the text. It's not like text and one illustration per chapter. There's almost one illustration per page in the book. But it's not quite like a graphic novel either. It's kind of like a hybrid approach. So that also makes it kind of unique.
Yeah, so there's a lot to touch upon there. So before we go too much into the book itself, right? I guess I'm going to back up a little bit because, you went through a whole journey here, looking up your family history, learning about, and I'm going to mispronounce it, Mentakoki, was it?
Mitio Goku, and I'm probably mispronouncing
Mitakoki.
her name as well,
Um,
but
yeah, and clearly there must have been like a lot of mystery behind like sort of, what made her so compelling and inspiring back then and something that draws you to her. So I can see, how that inspired, this whole book. But I guess the question I'm more interested in is that the fact that you kind of have to bridge the Indigenous and the French-Canadian cultural traditions within the book. So was that challenging when you were trying to face both respectively? Was there any difficulty in that they had to overcome, or did you find it pretty just seamless based on your family history?
I think what it gave me and it gave the book was a kind of internal tension in the story, because one of the themes of the story is just a misunderstanding or miscommunication between the French culture and the Indigenous culture in Quebec. And right off of the first chapter, grandfather Charles, who's the grandfather in the story of Mitio Goku, he's talking to a French priest, and he says to him in their conversations, "Is I don't understand you French. You're so focused in on hierarchy and titles for authority, when we look at it as we get our authority. A man has authority within the village based on his talents and his wisdom that he has internal, not because a king gave him his title." And that's just one example. And there's always that tension, and it's well-meaning. Both the French and the Algonquin, they want to communicate, but there's always, and they mean well, they intend to communicate, but there's always that gap. And that certainly is one of the themes of the book. So kind of gave a creative energy to the storytelling.
Yeah, I would definitely describe it as that energy, right? I mean, it's funny, even the picture behind you has like the Northern Lights, more energy, right? I can see that kind of theme coming out. So then, yeah, I mean, kind of you started to transition a little bit more into the writing process here and your collaboration with the different artists. And, I think that's really unique for the authors listening today because, a majority of us might not have artwork in the book. They have maybe like cover art and that's about it. So, I'm very interested to know, like, how did that process work? How collaborative was it? Like, to what extent did you decide what the images look like? And, was there any challenges collaborating with somebody else or? Tell me all about it. Lots of questions.
Okay. All right.
I'm very curious.
I'm very much in my storytelling, my creative process of my stories. Excuse me. I'm very visual. Before I actually put a story down to writing, I see it unfold as a movie in my mind. I see the images and it plays out that way. So I'm very much focused on the visual means. So when I wrote this story, I always wanted to see the images. Now, I have no artistic talent of my own. I don't think I could draw a straight line with a ruler, but I was very gifted to work with two artists. Now you may say, why do we need two artists? Well, when you have a project this size, you really need to have someone to be the pioneer, to kind of map out exactly how those illustrations are going to go, because that's probably where most of the mental energy is put into. So in this case, it was Masami. And so we would go through and we would talk about each chapter of the book. And we would talk about what my ideas for some of the illustrations, what they would look like. She would come up with a storyboard palette, and we talk about it, make some adjustments, and then we place them in the story. So that roadmap is already built for Natasha when she came in. And she would come in and she would put the next layer on top. So she would add the colors and the details, and she would also add in her own changes and her own spin to the illustrations as well. So she wasn't like just filling in the lines based on what Masami did. But it was a very difficult process. I think that if you look at a children's book, for example, let's say 30 pages and it's illustrated, it's very easy to do, in a small project. Let's say, you need to redo some illustrations working with the artist, and it may take a little bit more time. And for a smaller project, that's okay. But when you have a project that's 2 years long when it comes to doing the illustrations, every delay, every change that you feel like you need to make to try to get that high quality that you want into the storybook like that, that lost time is accumulative. So from an economic point of view, it becomes very much of a challenge and for myself and also for the artist.
Right, understood. So it's basically like it's time being that, you're trying to get the book out there and every minute lost is a little bit of time lost on its shelves. But I'm assuming you're also referring to like the payment end as well. To have
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
If you do a fixed price contract, working with an artist for like this, for a project like this, over time, that lost time adds up towards the end. Then the artist could be putting more work in, but not getting paid because the contract has already been paid.
Right. And then vice versa with hourly, then
yes,
comes more than you would have hoped. Yeah.
So that's probably one of the challenges of working on a project like this of this size.
What kind of advice would you offer for somebody like that? Like, do you see one as better than the other, or?
I'm sorry, what?
Like, what kind of advice would you offer to somebody who was also looking to work with an illustrator? I mean, which path is probably better in your opinion?
I think to go for a smaller book. I think initially, I started writing the books and I didn't really know how many stories I was actually going to end up with. So as I was working with Natasha, I would go, oh, I've got another idea for a story. And it was great. And we put it in there and added in there. So I think the first advice I would give is divide up your book, especially if you're in a project this large 40,000 word story, for example, like this one, is break it up into smaller books, into a series. And that's what I'm doing with the next books in this, the Old Grandmother series. Is there going to be single stories, probably with illustrations, maybe about 100 pages. And I think it's a lot easier to manage. So keep it small and see it as an opportunity to create a series of books instead of one big project.
Understood. Okay, well, there you go. That's a tip for everyone right now to listen to and think about. If you're trying to collaborate with somebody else, it might be better to start small, see how things work, get an idea for each other's styles and what you're looking for before diving into something huge. Thankfully, yours did work out, though, because there it is on the shelves and it looks beautiful and gorgeous, and it really represents everything that you want to get across.
I think so. And I think the other thing that made it very important was I had a very strong connection and communication, a sense of common vision with the artist. And I think you have to have that personal relationship because you have to understand each other, what the other person is thinking. I can see how Masami and Natasha are going to do their illustrations in my mind before they even do it. And it's actually pretty close. That's how tight of a relationship that I have, working relationship I have with my artists. And I think that's also important when you select an artist to work with. It's not a mechanical process where you say, okay, I give you money, you do illustrations, and we're done. There has to be a relationship.
Right. You need to enjoy each other's company. I mean,
That's right.
Talking to each other nonstop. You can't be dreading that text from your illustrator or vice versa, right? It's got to be fun for you both and to collaborate well. So that's an amazing tip too, making sure you both have that same vision. So that being said, I'd love to dive more into the content of the book now a little bit. One of the characters, I was just looking at the beginning a little bit, the character of Whiskin, the
Whiskey Jam.
I always mispronounce it. I'm so sorry for that. Would you mind just saying that again for us? Whiskin?
Whiskey Jam.
Whiskey-Jam. Okay, understood.
Whiskey Jam. He's the Raven character.
So it's a raven, and she's a spiritual messenger in your stories. Could you explain the significance of these trickster figures and Indigenous storytelling traditions, and why the raven in particular?
Well, tricksters are universal, not just in Native American mythology, but it's universal
like
to almost all mythology.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even in modern storytelling, like the Seinfeld characters, for example, they're trickster characters. Bugs Bunny, he's another trickster character. So tricksters are a very universal motif. And so I used trickster animal characters. What they do is they help drive the connections in the story, kind of help drive the plot by creating mischief, stirring things up a bit. And in this case, Whiskey Jan, every character, every trickster character I have in the book has its own different role different power and different kind of personality as well. And Whiskey Jan is definitely, he's the communicator. And I think I picked him for that because he is a bird, he flies, and so that he can actually bridge the gap between the earth and and the sky.
Yeah, I think it was really cool, to be honest, especially like I think I saw a couple illustrations of him too, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I know. I think it's really fun to think about, and there's a real cool element of it. And not to mention the relationships between the different characters as well. It's clear that you've put a lot of thought into making sure that it was just clearly highlighted and they have that depth, you know what I mean? That's in my notes here, that's Charles and Pierre Coke?
Coke.
Yeah, Coke. I guess I'm curious also, I mean, do you think that you use these relationships to also reflect that theme of the cultural exchanges and understanding that we were talking about before?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Grandfather Charles in the story is Mitio Goku's grandfather. And when I begin the story, it's 5 years after the attack. And Grandfather Charles and his wife are talking about their granddaughter and saying, it's been 5 years. She's still young. It's not good for her to be by herself like that. And so he goes to the priest and says, you should tell Pierre to marry Mitio Goku. And the priest is like, I can't do that. They have to make that choice on their own. And so Grandfather Charles, on his own, goes to the French village, finds Pierre, and basically says, come with me. And he brings him in front of Mitio Goku and kind of reintroduces them to each other. And it is a kind of a connection. I would say that it's more of like Grandfather Charles sees himself as a mentor, not only for Mitio Goku, but also for Pierre. And his role in the story is he knows that Pierre and Mitio Goku love each other, but for some reason they just really can't really let it take that to the next conclusion, which is a marriage. And so he kind of reintroduces them to each other in the story and uses his influence to say, Pierre, you are going to be a good grandfather, a good father. I mean, look at the way how the children in our village, in the Algonquin village, greet you when you come in. The children love you, and why is that? Because they know that you love them, you listen to them, you play with them, you care about them. And he tells his granddaughter that who's afraid to marry again because she's afraid of loss. She's afraid of losing children again. She already lost everything, and she's afraid of risking that again. But Grandfather Charles tells Mitio Goku, he says, all the young mothers in the village rely on you to help take care of their children. And why is that? Because they know that you would defend them. Not only do you love them and take care of them, but that you would protect them with your very life. And that's the kind of wisdom that Grandfather Charles, and they finally look at their situations, we can do this. We can begin again and make something beautiful with our lives.
Yeah, I love that a lot. And, not even only those character relationships that you built, but also the dialogue too. Even the way that you just described it, it's powerful. It makes you think, right? It's not just, simple words. It really, I can only imagine that it comes from those indigenous languages even. So I'm wondering, how did you incorporate these elements within the book? And just, I guess you had to do a lot of research, I would assume, correct?
Well, we did.
Yeah.
We did do a lot of research. For one, we had to make, a lot of our images of Native Americans, I think, especially in this country, come from what we see in Hollywood. And Hollywood movies will very often show, Native communities from the plains. They don't show, how people lived in, like, for example, Quebec. They didn't really use teepees. They had longhouses. They dressed in warmer clothing because Quebec, of course, is a more northern climate. So doing the research of the clothing was very important. And the other thing I did when we researched this is I tried to avoid all those tropes. Grandfather Charles, he's obviously the leader of the Algonquin community, and not only the Algonquin community, but also the neighboring French community in the sense that they respect him. But Grandfather Charles doesn't have any titles in the story besides just being a grandfather. And and I did that on purpose because I didn't want to label him the chief or the sachem or any other terms, number one, that I'm not familiar with how they're used properly. But also I think that it's kind of a trope, I think. And I wanted Grandfather Charles' qualities to speak for themselves as a person. Why he's respected? Well, he is because he's wise, because he's caring. He's also a man of action.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, the fact that it's a trope, yes, but also in a way it's also his actual literal role too. So it's kind of an interesting paradox in a way.
Yes, yes.
But I see what you mean, though. It's important to have that kind of like show not tell element and leading the readers to come to the conclusions themselves. To all the listeners here today, maybe that's a tip that they can take home today, is to make your characters not seem too tropey or cliche, then let them come to the conclusions themselves. Maybe it's a challenging thing to do. Do you have any tips about how you made that happen?
I would say is identify those tropes, stay away from them. And like you said, show it and don't tell, especially I think when you're dealing with traditional cultures like First Nations cultures, it's very easy to fall into tropes. I think the noble, one thing you hear is quote unquote, the noble savage, or, like that. The Indigenous First Nation characters in the book are just people, and they come across that way. They're people with feelings and ideas and desires, and they're not set up like on any kind of pedestal or being a representative, except being just another representative of a human being. So I would say that if you are going to deal with a traditional culture and characters based on any kind of traditional culture, is remember that you are creating human beings first, and the culture they came from is second. And I think that if you follow that rule, you probably will be okay.
I like that line, you're creating people first, culture is second. I think that really resonates throughout your entire book, really being that it's so strongly interwoven with those sort of themes. So yeah, really insightful things for us to think about. As we start to wrap up today, I also want to make sure that I touch a little bit upon the writing process itself. You mentioned a little bit about, the research element, where it all came to be, but day-to-day life, what is your process? Do you have any rituals or practices that helped you connect with these stories that you were telling? Or was it more so maybe reading the stories over yourself?
I think I belong to other writers groups, so I actually talk to other writers. And one thing I see is that everyone has a different method. So what works for me is, I mentioned earlier, I'm very much a visual person, and the stories will kind of turn inside my mind and my imagination for a while until it just becomes like a burst dam, and it comes out all at once. And so when I'm ready to sit down and write, I sit down in front of the computer and I just go and go until it's all out on the paper, on the screen. So I'm not really a write by demand person. I have to write at the right moment. I have to let the process within myself kind of develop. And when it's ready, I just put it on there. No matter what time of the day it is, nighttime, early in the morning. Sometimes I've gotten up in the middle of the night and go, I've got an idea. I know exactly what I want to do for the story. And so I type it right out there and get it out there. So I think you have to understand yourself. Some people are, maybe you need to do an outline. And I hear people talking about that. I don't do any outlines at all for myself. Other people do. That may be a technique that works for you. But I think that you have to be self-observant as a writer. What works for you? And you go with that, and don't feel like you have to try to mold your style off what somebody else works. Like I said, I'm more of an intuitive writer. I write at the spur of the moment when I'm ready to write. Some people want to write at a certain time of day. Some people want to do an outline of all that story and map the whole process out and then go into it. It's different for every person. But I think you have to listen to yourself and not try to force you to do a particular style, but pay attention, what works for you, and then go with that.
Yeah, I guess that's what you have to do. Like, just figure out your own process, right? Whatever feels right. And then that's something we talk about a lot on, the show, is like, there's so many different ways. Which one's the right one? It's basically what feels best to you.
Right.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh,
No, I was just going to add to that. One of the things also, especially if you're doing creative writing,
Mhm.
is that if you're very much an intuitive person, you have to let the inner voice work and the creative process work within yourself. And it works sometimes at a very subconscious level. As I've created the stories, I realized that there were elements I put into earlier stories that seemed really kind of unrelated, but mattered very much later in later stories in that connection. So it's also part of that process. And maybe that works for you. And that's one of the reasons why I don't really like outlines, because it's very restrictive. I like going to where my imagination and where that process leads.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that, right? Sometimes you get constrained thinking, you have to have this certain section in the book and it has to be right
Right.
here. So allowing yourself that freedom is always something that, I encourage my readers, my listeners to this podcast
Yes,
to hold
very
on to
much.
as well. Well, Joseph, it's been a pleasure talking about this book. I'm curious to know, what else is on the horizon for you? I mean, you have this guy out. Do you have any other books, either in the works or out on the shelves?
Well, right now I have three future books in the Old Grandmother series.
Oh,
There's
wow.
some reviews that they're in the works right now. It's at various stages. So the next one is going to come out is August, so it's not that far. It's called The Dance of Creation, and it is both a sequel and a prequel to Old Grandmother's Tree. And the book after that is the text is written, and Masami is doing the storyboard for right now. Is called All Around You There Is a Light, and that'll be coming out next summer. And then I have some notes, kind of initial start of the story for a book that'll probably come out in 2027, but I don't have a title for that. So I'm working on 3 books right now, various stages. Dance of Creation, all the storyboard illustrations are done. Natasha's going to start working in a couple of weeks, and that story should be out in August. And it's called The Dance of Creation because a grandfather, 100 Algonquin grandfather, 100 years in the future in Pembroke, Ontario, is going to be sitting around a campfire telling his children about the creation of the world.
That sounds really exciting, to be honest. And I think, especially if you're a fan of these books, I can only imagine, what's going to be in store for these. And it's good to know you have the same artists as well, so that's really exciting. As mentioned before, I know, this time around, it should be a lot easier, being that you're on the same page with what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so, to everybody listening today, we're going to put the links to those well, actually, where can we stay updated on these books? So I'm assuming you have a website, right, Joseph?
I do have a website. It's called oldgrandmotherstree.com. And on that website, you'll see a sample of additional illustrations besides the one you see behind me right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have a wiki. I have a character wiki. So you have all the characters are listed in there, right in there. Some characters haven't even appeared yet. They'll appear in a future book, but they're right there. And I also have an events page where I'm going to be doing book signings and selling the books, and also some links to some of the podcasts I've also have done.
That's really exciting. So thank you for sharing that. And we're going to put the link to that also in the description box so you can stay up to date, check out the resources, and stay in touch, because, some people like to just send messages to authors and talk about, their work or writing tips, all that. So I'm sure, you can always reach out to him. Their connections are what matter. You have to reach out, chat. You never know what you're going to learn.
Yes, yes.
So do you have any last bits of advice for the aspiring authors on the show today?
I would say is set your goals of what you really want out of these books. If you're writing a short little book and you just want to publish, that's one thing. If you're going to create an illustrated project or a larger project, you have to be prepared that this is also going to be a financial investment upfront for yourself as well. So really think about what you're trying to accomplish and be prepared to invest those resources, whether that's time. It took thousands of hours to get for this project come up, and thousands of dollars of investment also in this book. So think about that make sure you count what you're willing to spend and make sure it matches what you really want to get, what your objectives are for the book.
Yeah, it's always a good tip, right? Get a good idea for what you are supposed to be paying and be prepared for it. I've had a lot of clients who, expect one thing to be a certain price, and then they're very shocked later on. So always have that open communication with your, ghostwriter, your editor, and, really figure out, or whoever else you might be working with. I know I said ghostwriter, that's silly. But, anybody who you are working with, always have that open communication, know what you're going into. I definitely agree there. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, again, Joseph, though, you taught us a lot more than just that, too. You taught us about, researching your heritage, bringing that to life. And I think that's a huge thing, too. Like, lots of writers want to write something. They might be a little stuck about what to write about. Why not your own heritage? Why not your own family, right? So, really.
Yeah, it is. It's been very fun. And one thing I look at it as that, even from a meta point of view, me even writing the story is a continuation of Mitio Goku's story. That we are the continuation of the story of our ancestors. Their story doesn't end when they die. We're that continuation. So even writing this story, this book about her, is in a very meta sense also her story, a continuation of that story itself.
That's really interesting to think about. Maybe like in, book number 5, you'll find yourself writing about yourself, but back in like 2022 when you were writing this book, and just kind of like ends up being a cycle.
It is.
No, it is funny though, and very interesting. So again, everybody, please check it out. The artwork's beautiful. The words are beautiful. It's meaningful. And honestly, I think anybody could relate to it, because at the end of the day, I mean, we all have, ties and roots of our own. So this is a great way to kind of learn about how they do intersect, right? So really cool stuff. Well, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. It's been a really fascinating conversation for sure. Learned a ton about the book and the writing process also.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I'd be happy to come back when the next book comes out this summer.
Oh, please. No, that would be awesome. You definitely should, and we can promote that and get everybody excited for book number 2. I mean, I'm already looking forward to checking it out. So yeah, thanks again. And to our listeners, Joseph's approach really just reminds us that the most compelling stories come from your own personal connections, just like I mentioned before. You take that to heart. His research combined with storytelling creates just a book that honors, the truths of the ancestors' lives, the folklore of their traditions. And Joseph, thanks again for sharing your insights to our listeners. I hope this conversation inspires you to explore your own heritage, find the stories that resonate with your identity, perhaps begin your own journey as an author. And don't forget to check out more episodes and to check out Joseph's website. Until next time, keep reading, keep writing, keep inspiring. We'll see you next time.
This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.